Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant. Today I'm going to be covering this book, The Lost Continent, by Bill Bryson, subtitled Travels in Small Town America. I picked this book up back in 2018 or 2019, and I brought it along during that summer camp where I had just a bin of books to read throughout the summer. One of my coworkers and friends who is from Vermont commented on, oh yeah, Bill Bryson's a good author, and I guess he'd read some of Bill Bryson's work before. So having that opinion going into this book, he is a good author. I haven't read any of his other works yet though, just because it's not so fantastic that I need to read other things by him. It's a fun book though, about almost like rediscovering Americana. There's a few good portions in here that are just kind of repetitive in a way, but in a wholesome way. It's also kind of autobiographical. The best way to put it is that the opening to the first chapter simply reads, "I come from Des Moines. Someone had to." And then he continues to talk about living in Iowa, living in Des Moines for the rest of the chapter, and how he eventually got out, but he's one of the few that do. Another way to put it is that the first chapter is kind of like an introduction in any other book. It was against this disturbed and erratic background that I became gripped with a curious urge to go back to the land of my youth and make what the blurb writers like to call a journey of discovery, on another continent 4,000 miles away. I became quietly seized with that nostalgia that overcomes you when you have reached the middle of your life, and your father has recently died, and it dawns on you that when he went, he took some of you with him. I wanted to go back to the magic places of my youth, to Mackinac Island, the Rocky Mountains, Gettysburg, and see if they were as good as I remembered them being. Fueled with that self-discovery mindset, Bill Bryson goes about traveling America. As an example of that nostalgic tone, he says at one point, "On the edge of town was an old motel which looked pretty seedy, though judging by the absence of charred furniture in the front yard, it was clearly a step up from the sort of place my dad would have chosen. I pulled onto the gravel drive and went inside. A woman of about 75 was sitting behind the desk. She wore butterfly glasses and a beehive hairdo. She was doing one of those books that require you to find words in a massive letter and circle them. I think it was called Word Puzzles for Morons. 'Help you,' she drawled without looking up. 'I'd like a room for the night, please.' 'That'll be $38.50, she replied, and as her pen fell greedily on the word yup. I was nonplussed. In my day, a motel room cost about $12. 'I don't want to buy the room,' I explained. 'I just want to sleep in it for one night.' She looked at me gravely over the top of her glasses. 'The room is $38.50 per night plus tax. You want it or not?' She had one of those disagreeable accents that add a syllable to every word. Tax came out as tax. We both knew that I was miles from anywhere. 'Yes, please,' I said contritely. And this happens only in the first 30 pages. He just sounds disappointed with some of this Americana that he finds. But then, with some of it, it just seems more fun and happy. Some of these pages have faint highlighting. I never highlighted this, and it seems really random, like someone just needed to highlight something on a page to show that they had read it. Doesn't really make sense. So, for example, here on page 46, it used to be that when you came to the outskirts of a town, you would find a gas station and a Dairy Queen, maybe a motel or two if it was a busy road or the town had a college. Now every town, even a quite modest one, has a mile or more of fast food places, motor inns, discount cities, shopping malls, all with 30-foot high revolving signs and parking lots the size of Shropshire." This book was from 1989, so some of it is dated, but some of it is also just even contemporarily ubiquitous. The town I grew up in, when I was going to high school, I heard about how the main place you would practice driving and crossing a stoplight was going across US 301, which cut through my hometown. You would go behind one bookstore to another road, turn a left, turn another left, go across 301 on 228, then take another left, go down that road until you got back to the road where you would turn a left, cross the road, and pass the bookstore. That was a convenient place for practicing left turns. You could do the opposite, do right turns for practicing across stoplights, across traffic. But when I was growing up, it was all suburban sprawl. There were some elements of that mile long of fast food, bull crap that you get in Bryson's Disappointing America that I grew up in, and I'm sure everyone can relate to it to some degree. Anyone who grew up in a suburb or an exit off of a main highway, It's just cookie cutter in a way that America is. And then there's paragraphs like this, which I personally chuckle at. This line, I was headed for Cairo, which is pronounced Cairo. I don't know why. They do this a lot in the South and Midwest. In Kentucky, Athens is pronounced Athens. Versailles is pronounced Versailles. Bolivar, Missouri is Bolivar. Madrid, Iowa is Madrid. An example he doesn't give here, Miami, Oklahoma is pronounced Miami by the locals. That one is one I know I have bonded with Oklahomans because I know the right way to pronounce Miami. One chapter I really enjoyed is chapter 11, where he describes traveling through Virginia. He says, Virginia went on and on. It never seemed to end. The state is nearly 400 miles across, but the twisting road must have added at least 100 miles to that. In any case, every time I looked at the map, I seemed to have moved a remarkably tiny distance. So, during this chapter, he goes to Colonial Williamsburg, which is a cool little destination. I went to Colonial Williamsburg as a child on a field trip. The town of Williamsburg has nice bars, nice restaurants, nice places. It also has Great Wolf Lodge, which is a chain indoor water park. My friends and I used to go there for some fun during January, right after New Year's when school was opening back up, and so we had the park all to ourselves. We'd go into town, enjoy it, we'd have some fun hanging around together in a hotel away from home. It was a nice vacation to spend with friends. Colonial Williamsburg is a small attraction, a reenactment town, much in the same way as that one South Park episode where they go to the old town reenactment village and everyone's really obnoxious. He talks about that somewhat, that it seems dry, that everything seems manufactured, and that everything seems scripted, but in a very Disney World-esque way. He then also explains how in the 1920s, Rockefeller developed a passion for the place and began pouring money into its restoration. The problem now is that you never quite know what's genuine and what's fanciful. Take the Governor's Palace. It looks to be very old, and as I say, no one discourages you from believing that it is. But, in fact, it was only built in 1933. The original building burned down in 1781, and by 1930 had been gone for so long that nobody knew what it had looked like. It was only because somebody had found a drawing of it in the Bodleian Library at Oxford that they were able to make a reasonable stab at reproducing it. But it isn't old, and it may not even be all that accurate. On the last 2 pages of this chapter, he discusses visiting Mount Vernon, which is much closer to my hometown, and we could visit it as an easy day trip. If you've never been to Mount Vernon, he describes it pretty well here, and really captures why it is more interesting than a lot of other reenactment style places. It is an open museum, Mount Vernon being George Washington's home, and it is kept in a renovated style the way George Washington is known to have had his home. But it's not whitewashed. They emphasize that he had, slave quarters, that he had stables, that he had a fishing operation, that he had all these different parts of his plantation as part of his home. And there are people in that reenactment garb that really seem to know how to present information in an engaging and educational way. It's a great place for a day trip, for a field trip, because those people there are really committed to teaching you about George Washington. As he says on page 112, Mount Vernon was everything Williamsburg should have been and was not. Genuine, interesting, instructive. For well over a century, it has been maintained by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, and what a lucky thing it is that we have them. Amazingly, when the house was put up for sale in 1853, neither the federal government nor the state of Virginia was prepared to buy it for the nation. So a group of dedicated women hastily formed the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, raised the money to buy the house and 200 acres of grounds, and then set about restoring it to precisely as it was in Washington's day, right down to the correct pigments of paint and patterns of wallpaper. Today, the association continues to run it with a dedication and skill that should be models to preservation groups everywhere, but alas, are not. 14 rooms are open to the public, and in each a volunteer provides an interesting and well-informed commentary, and is sufficiently clued up to answer almost any question on how the room was used and decorated. The house was very much Washington's creation. He was involved in the daintiest questions of decor, even when he was away on military campaigns. It was strangely pleasing to imagine him at Valley Forge, with his troops dropping dead of cold and hunger, agonizing over the purchase of lace ruffs and tea cozies. What a great guy. What a hero. That is one of those locations of early American history that I feel are taken care of respectfully and reverently. The people that manage it know and understand the less savory parts of George Washington's history, but aren't ashamed of it. Or rather, they're ashamed of it, but still respectful of providing us a window into his life. I know, for example, Fort Washington, a few miles south of Washington, D.C. I know my dad brought me and my family there. It is a really interesting site for understanding and seeing what a classic fort might have looked like. And honestly, it looks like a castle. I've been to Carlisle in England. Carlisle Castle, much bigger, but it looks very similar to Fort Washington. It's a stone structure, a stone fortification. Mount Vernon has some qualities like that too, and it's actually across the river from Fort Washington. Fort Washington could, if it had wanted to, fire cannon into Mount Vernon. He then reads that he took US 301 out past Annapolis and the US Naval Academy and over a long, low bridge across the Chesapeake Bay into eastern Maryland. I'm from Maryland, and honestly, this part is especially funny to me because it's from at least 13 years before I can really recall going out there, but it's really true to modern Eastern Shore as well, or at least Eastern Shore when I remember it. Before 1952, when the bridge was built, the eastern side of the bay had enjoyed centuries of isolation. Ever since then, people have been saying that outsiders will flood in and ruin the peninsula, but it still looked pretty unspoiled to me, and my guess is that it's the outsiders who have kept it that way. It's always the outsiders who are the most fiercely opposed to shopping malls and bowling alleys, which the locals, in their simple, trusting way, tend to think might be kind of handy. Chestertown, the first town of any size I came to, confirmed this. The first thing I saw was a woman in a bright pink tracksuit zipping past on a bicycle with a wicker basket on the front. Only an urban émigré would have a bicycle with a wicker basket. A local person would have a Subaru pickup truck. The last portion of this book that I'm going to read and talk about is a part that really made me chuckle when I read it. In 2014 and 2015, I drove across country from Maryland to Seattle, Washington to watch the Dota 2 Internationals, and the fastest and most expedient and efficient way to get there was picking up Interstate 90 and then just hanging on it for 1,500 miles. You pick up, on that route at least, Interstate 90 in eastern South Dakota, and as you head west, you are bombarded with signs for something, which Bill Bryson talks about here. 50 miles beyond Rapid City is the little town of Wall, home of the most famous drugstore in the West, Wall Drug. You know it's coming because every 100 yards or so along the whole of that 50 miles, you pass a big billboard telling you, steak and cakes, Wall Drug, 47 miles. Hot beef sandwiches, Wall Drug, 36 miles. 5-cent coffee, Wall Drug, 25 miles, and so on. It is the advertising equivalent of the Chinese water torture. After a while, the endless drip, drip, drip of billboards so clouds your judgment that you have no choice but to leave the interstate and have a look at it. It's an awful place, one of the world's biggest tourist traps, but I loved it and I wouldn't have a word said against it. And then he goes on to explain how Wall Drug came about, and it's a nice story of economic opportunity. He came at Wall Drug from the west. I came at it from the east. And for 250 miles or so, you're just bombarded with so many signs for Wall Drug that from a longer distance, I did not want to go there. I saw it from the road and that was all I needed. If I was coming at it, my first experience with it was coming from the west to the east, I might have felt it wasn't obnoxious enough. But I counted in 2015 253 signs for Wall Drug. It is probably a giant inside joke in South Dakota knowing about it and joking about Wall Drug. Eventually, he drives across South Dakota. He visited all but 10 of the lower 48 states and drove 13,978 miles. He saw pretty much everything he wanted to and a good deal of things he didn't. And eventually, he drove on to Des Moines. And the story ends there. It's a fun book about Americana, about traveling and stopping in the small towns, not driving on the interstates and breezing through everything. It's the kind of driving that I want to do someday if I have enough time to take off. I'm not sure I ever will, but it's a dream. And this guy experienced it. And he's a good enough writer to write a narrative about that travel and make it fun. And honestly, it's a good book. I haven't read it more than twice in 2019 and skimming it while reviewing it for this video. But it's fun, it's funny, and it's really interesting. He understands what makes America, small town America, good. But it's very apolitical as well. And I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. It's kind of Mayberry-esque in a way, but anyway, I paid, according to this marking, $4 for it, and I had a good time with it. It was an interesting book, and I think if any one of you wants to read about Americana, that small town motel staying experience, this is a good book for you. And I'm told Bill Bryson's a good author and that you should read other things, so I'll probably echo that. Bill Bryson was good in this book, and you should check out other books of his. Anyway, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant.